March 1st marked Zero Discrimination Day, and according to UNAIDS.org, women and girls around the world continue to face a barrage of challenges that undermine their access to equal rights, opportunities and treatment. Tonight we have with us the Director for the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Committee, Mr. Ashwin Raj, to discuss these issues in depth. Good evening and welcome to the show.
Good evening, Geraldine, and good evening, Fiji. Thank you for having me on the show.
So most people may not understand the importance or the significance of setting aside a day to celebrate and also to commemorate Zero Discrimination Day. In Fiji, on a multitude of levels, do you see discrimination being part and parcel of life and people not recognizing that they are participating in discrimination?
Absolutely, and I think there's a reason why the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission has that added anti-discrimination scope under the 2013 Constitution, precisely because the chain of equivalence between human rights and anti-discrimination is not such an obvious one. And there are a lot of people that have asked, why do we have that additional scope in terms of anti-discrimination? Because it goes beyond, it is pretty much woven into the fabric of human rights. But to a lot of people, it's not obvious that this is a human rights issue. The other thing is that the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights of the Fijian Constitution, there's a very, very clear definition of discrimination as well. And of course, Section 26, subsection 3, on prohibited grounds of discrimination actually prescribes all of those areas that are grounds on which you cannot possibly discriminate a person, and those include race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, disability, nationality, health, marital status, pregnancy, language, place of origin, so on and so forth. And so, prescribing prohibited grounds of discrimination, has a particular intent to it, precisely because the Constitution and the Bill of Rights has to be responsive to the context in which it operates. Otherwise, it's just prescriptive, right? There are putative claims in law, but in order to be able to materialize those aspirations in the Bill of Rights, it needs to be situated into the fabric of society. And precisely because we, as a society, experience discrimination on various grounds, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights needs to be responsive to that, so that to an extent there can be remedies as well for people that suffer unfair discrimination.
But looking at it objectively, have you seen that this notion of discrimination on many grounds that's been woven into the fabric of society, need I say also into one's personality and living, have you seen that there have been any changes? Is there a marked increase or possible more tolerance towards certain things that may lead to a decrease of discrimination?
It is a lugubrious consolation that we have such strong and salutary legal safeguards against anti-discrimination. We try and uphold the principle of non-discrimination and embed it into the various initiatives and policies and all of that. But at the same time, I've noticed that discrimination has now is so thoroughly metastasized in our body politic, like cancer, that it is able to adapt and morph into something else. And it's so insidious that to an extent that people wouldn't actually realize that, one, they're complicit in an act which is discriminatory, or two, that they have been subjected to something which is essentially discriminatory. You see what I mean? And so, and for a lot of people, it's actually easier to laugh at or laugh with as opposed to sort of, taking that critical distance and questioning and saying, all right, this particular sort of, stereotyping and this particular joke, right, in fact, robs somebody of their sense of dignity, or can become the basis for greater intolerance in society, or in fact escalate into physical harm or psychological harm.
So
right?
with that in mind, if one were to consciously make the decision to no longer be part and parcel of these practices, of these paradigms of thinking, how does one make the distinction between critical analysis of something, voicing opinions or judgments that are being made, and discrimination?
Let me give you a good example. The retrogressive developments that took place last week, right? There's an image of a head boy of a particular school who's actually wearing a beard, and it's posted on the social media, and there's a concerned parent who's saying that, why is the head boy of this particular school allowed to wear the beard while my children can't, right? You look at it at the most superficial level, you think, hey, what's the big deal? Where, why this moral opprobrium around something like that? Seems like the parent is concerned and all of that. Dig a little deeper, right, as I did before we issued the statement, you'll actually see that, undergirding all of that are all of these issues around religion, around, incrimination, because you are, trying to distinguish an individual from another. Of course, we know that identities are made in the face of difference. You are what I'm not, okay, and all of that. But we also know that as we begin to distinguish an individual, that becomes the basis of stereotyping. Stereotyping leads to entrenched discrimination. The question that I have for this individual is, why did you have to single out this one particular child, right? If you were so concerned about your children, you could have partly raised it with the ministry. But did you? No, you did not. You decided to isolate this one particular child, put his photograph, and let's not circumlocute around this issue, right? He is a Muslim. This is a Muslim school. And there's rampant Islamophobia in this country. I know most people won't call it out for what it is because they're being politically correct. I don't need to. There's rampant Islamophobia in this country. We saw it, when there was this whole, debate around the celebration of Prophet Muhammad's birthday. Some of the most vile things were put on the social media around that. Okay, then you look at the posting of the image of this particular child. Right? And his only crime is that he's wearing a beard. The debasement, the racist and bigoted comments that ensued from that post is what does the damage. You just need one individual to put something that seems seemingly banal, right, out there, and it just ignites. And this is how discrimination works. This is how insidious it is, right? And the person says, in his defense, Ben Padarat said, look, I'm exercising my right to freedom of expression. My mother was a cabinet minister and all of that. I'm sorry, your right to freedom of expression does not give you that particular right to discriminate and incriminate somebody, right, in terms of the right to religion and education. You could have still, expressed democratic dissent and written to the minister directly. What was the point of posting the image of that particular child?
There's a lot more to dissect from that.
Absolutely.
And we will continue this discussion right after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Mr. Raj, we were talking about a particular case of discrimination which gained not just local appeal, but also internationally. A lot of people outside of Fiji who have a vested interest in what this matter was had been voicing their opinion. Now, before we get back to your comments that you made in the earlier segment, just on that notion of discriminating against one particular individual on a social media platform where you know has the potential to reach audience globally and to, if I may say, victimize one child who is a minor. He does not have to be subjected to treatment like that. We saw comments by grown adults of different backgrounds who had said the most incredulous things in support of what they called their right to express themselves, which of course is different from voicing an opinion.
Look, you know, it's interesting. I watch these spaces very, very, closely. First argument that falls flat on its face is that, oh, I'm trying to, exercise my right to freedom of expression. You could do that without incriminating this particular child. Two, everybody should know that he is a child. You have not taken his consent and you've posted his photograph. Did you seek his consent? Did you ask his parents? No, you did not. How would you feel? I mean, he talks about his children. How would he feel if somebody posted his children's photographs out there? Isn't that an interdiction of the right to privacy? Why should we be posting images of children? And then there's, this whole vile sort of stuff going on about whether, he really is a child or not because he looks like an adult by virtue of the fact that he's got a beard. Then, one of the media, has recently published that, oh, there was no police report filed, so it's not a big deal. I mean, that's the intimation. Honestly, I mean, does it have to escalate to that point before we call something discriminatory, that we are stereotyping and all of that, in a country that is emerging out of the detritus of institutionalized racism, in a country where there is so much communalist undertone every corner that we turn? We are so obsessed with which, ethnicity is represented where, which particular religious group is on what particular board, who's the head teacher of one particular school, so and so. We can't seem to look past that prism. In that kind of context, are you seriously telling me that, really, no police complaint was lodged, so we don't know what the damage was? You see what I mean? My point to everyone this evening is this. These actions are repugnant to the values of multiculturalism, to tolerance, and to unity, right? The point is that we've had so much of these divisions in this country. The kerfuffle we had around Diwali, right? I mean, it's a celebration that, that has, invariably taken place for the last 149 years. Not a big deal. Then all of a sudden, what do? You pit two religious communities against each other. Diwali on its own is a non-issue. The moment you pit it against, say, the rights of Christians and, the fact that, it somehow the other disturbs the peace on a Sunday, that's where the trouble begins. As I said again, people need to understand that identities are made in the face of difference. It really is not about just the child with a beard. It is about the child being an insignia, a symbol, right, of something larger. And that's what the story is all about. And that is what they're now trying to sort of divert from and saying, what's the big deal? It is a big deal because we keep seeing this day in, day out in this country. We're not looking at serious issues around poverty. We're not looking at serious issues around structural inequality and all of that. We're not looking at so many people out on the streets or persons with disability and all of that. I mean, apparently, because it's Discrimination Day, we have got a human rights lawyer, who huffs and puffs all the time, suddenly thought that we are trying to, shy away from serious human rights issues in terms of police brutality and all of that, and fighting for car parks for persons with disability. This, to me is a sad indictment of where we are. When I issued a very clear statement about this incident where they posted the image of this child, in relation to Ben Padar, nobody condemned all of those things. They said, so in this case, Mr. Raj ascertained the facts very quickly. I mean, what's confusing about this? The image is out there, the intention is very clear, the comments are all very clear. This is not the same as the USP issue. And yet they conflate these things, because in this country, we will do everything humanly possible to not have that conversation about discrimination. Right? And the ultimate safeguard that people always tend to have is they say, but this constitution was imposed on us, and this Fijian identity was imposed on all of us. I mean, really, 2 elections later? Are we seriously having this conversation? I mean, a lot of people suffer from social amnesia in this country. They seem to forget, and there's willful forgetfulness, that there was entrenched discrimination in this country. Right? There's so much intolerance in this country on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, and all of that. And this is what troubles me, that the moment you start to pit children against each other, right, you're basically poisoning the next generation. I mean, I'm 40 years old, and we all grew up, knowing just this one thing, that other community is the other. They're never regarded as humans, right? How many Indo-Fijians, call their, fellow Fijians, what do they call them? A number of disparaging, dehumanizing sort of, pejorative terms to refer to another community. How do we talk about Itokays in this country? How do we talk about the Chinese in this country, right? What kind of stereotypes do we have when it comes to Ratumans in this country? What about people who come from mixed heritage? Right? Constantly asked, so what do you follow? What's your religion? I mean, why do you have this, sort of this mixed thing? What do you eat? How do you worship? How does society react to you? You see, I mean, these are all sort of, signs of something deeper, this kind of, categorical anxiety you have towards somebody who's actually different. Do you really think that this was an innocent, concerned parent, posting an image of this particular child and troubled that why is this child being treated differently, without any intuition to the religious background of that particular student, the school that particular student comes from, and whether there is a religious founding for that of that particular school, whether the fact that everyone has the constitutional right under section 22 subsection 3 to not be compelled to take any kind of steps that might be contrary to their religious values. You see how banal the conversations are in Fiji, because people don't read, people don't think, they'd rather join the queue and attack.
Well, we're out of time for this particular segment, but join us for more on this discussion after this break. Welcome back. Mr. Raj, we're talking about the case of this particular adult victimizing and also putting on a global scale, in a national spotlight, the case of one child following his religious customs and traditions and the practices. But let's move on to something else that a lot of us don't tend to look at objectively. Here in Fiji, we tend to look at stereotypes not just as a stereotype, which is something that may be considered a lead up, a gateway to practicing discrimination openly by having that as our standby, that's our fallback. Oh, that's just what they like, that's just what we do, that's just how it is. Why is it that we are moving forward from that? What is the blockade? What is stopping us from moving past that barrier?
Let me give you an example. In 2016, the Human Rights Commission received a complaint from a student, and she was singled out for wearing a headscarf in that particular school, and the head of that school said, she can go find a school nearby that accommodates people of her kind, his exact words, because the headscarf is contrary to the school code, dress code. And we took that case up because we knew too well that today it's the headscarf, tomorrow it's going to be the symbol of crucifixion, it could be the turban, it could be, you know, a religious bangle or any other emblem for that matter. But the point is that if we as society go quiet now, because the person who's been singled out and incriminated is not quote unquote one of your kind, nobody's going to stand up for you the day they come for your children to stake their claim. You see what I mean? And so we intervene. And, you know, I have to say that our school system so far, you know, has been very inclusive. You know, for the most part, you know, when you have you know, children, they haven't been forced to wear pants, you know, when they can wear a sulu, and they should have the right to wear a sulu. And so I think that, you know, where you want to see difference, that's the only thing you're going to see. You're going to see difference. You see? Because that's what you're focused on. They're like drunk people looking for keys under the street light, right? They can't see the bigger picture. That difference and diversity should be your strength. People shouldn't be singled out and incriminated precisely because they hold on to certain values that define who they are, that sense of personhood, right? And so this is why I keep saying that we need to move away from that culture, because we've had years of this kind of strife around race and religion and other markers of difference. We need to get away from this rubbish, because this, quite frankly, is what is holding this country back. And this is why I keep talking about children and education being the last bastion of hope. The reason why I made the statement that I did, you know, in relation to Ben Padarat is because, you know, you really have to go out to the coffee shops, you have to go to our shopping malls or the cinema or even our classroom. It's filled with bright and bubbly kids who don't really care. Right? They don't really care whether somebody's sporting a beard because they're Muslim or somebody's wearing a cross or whatever. I see a lot of love, and I see unconditional love, right? And so it's a very, very dangerous thing when you go and you poison the minds of those kids and teach them that your friend that you've been hanging out with all this while is actually a Hindu or is actually a Christian. The other thing that I wanted to say is that when we talk about distinction and discrimination and all of that, we tend to metonymize a lot. So, you know, when that whole Diwali debate happened, right? So it was, you know, premised around this monolithic thing about, you know, Hindus and Christians. And people forget that there's diversity even within Christianity. So not everybody worships on a Sunday. There's Seventh-day Adventists as well. Right? And then there's further plurality. What discrimination does is that it metonymizes everything. It creates monolithic categories so that it becomes easier. I see you, I see brown, I see straight hair, I hear a peculiar accent, I've made a particular determination about you. But you're more than your stereotype, aren't you? Right? And so it's not who we are, it's when we are. That's the other issue that I wanted to raise. It's the climate in which this child from that particular Muslim school has been mobilized, right, in a particular kind of context. It's the event of that individual in this particular context where there's rampant Islamophobia, where there's rampant intolerance, right?
Yeah. I'd like to move on to something that you had mentioned. As you said, you saw me and you don't see me as just the structures of what you see. I am more than what you see. But I would like to talk about discrimination being used as a tool for exerting power over those that may not have all the access. Now, we started off this particular show talking about women and girls around the world, even right here in this country, that are not being given access to equal opportunities, to rights, to treatment, to even fair play on multiple levels, in the home, at work, in school, out in public, within their peer group, within their families, within their friends. And we'd like to look at that. Why is this still continuing, you know, regardless of their sexual identity, the
Yeah.
ladies, and also their age, of their disabilities, abilities, their education, whatever other markers they may have, just on their gender itself? Why are they being subjected to this by what most would say the patriarchy, but surprisingly
Yeah.
there are other women that also partake in discrimination against women?
Oh, look, this is an exercise, you know, in and off power, okay? And so, you know, we still get, you know, ranging from domestic violence, right? And people always think about domestic violence in terms of a heteronormative arrangement. We also hear of stories of domestic violence in same-sex relationships as well, right? So again, we need to break the stereotype. We need to also start thinking about, you know, the ways in which, you know, we, beyond gender, you know, assume ideologies of patriarchy and act out. And sometimes, you know, it really rattles the stereotype as well when women incriminate, you know, other women, or, you know, act out sort of, you know, ideas that would essentially be patriarchal and tied thoroughly to, you know, men and the masculine.
If I could just put a pin in that.
So a number of times, those stereotypes are, you know, actually, you know, pushed to the brink, because you do receive complaints that begin to trouble those perspectives. You see what I mean? But that doesn't change the fact that women and girls are disproportionately affected. But the point that we need to realize is that they're not just women and girls. You know, they occupy other subject positions as well. They are raced subjects. They are class subjects.
Mr.
They
Raj,
are
we'll put a
subjects
pin in
that have
that.
sexual orientation.
We'll put
You
a
see
pin
what I
in
mean?
that and come back to discuss this, because of course this deserves a lot of attention.
Yes.
It deserves quite a lot of discussion. And we'll be back with more right after this break. Welcome back. So, Ashwin, we're talking about women
Yes.
and the disparity between the treatment that they receive from even infancy right
Yes.
until old age,
Yeah.
across all levels. And you had mentioned that it's not just this notion of patriarchy that is suppressing them. Women also actively, whether knowingly or unknowingly, get involved in this, in suppressing women's rights, in their access to whether they want to get educated or whether they'd like to pursue different things, or because they happen to have a different ideology from the family, or maybe from their peers, whether it's to do with the work that they want to get into, the type of studies that they want to do, or whether even the way that they want to live.
So, I mean, the struggle, you know, there's a big spectrum. I mean, from, you know, from the get-go, the question around equal opportunity, you know, in the realm of the private to the public sphere. I mean, that remains you know, a huge struggle. You know, women and girls are treated, you know, most unfairly, you know, compared to the male counterparts and all of that. But then the spectrum begins to shift, and there's another layer of complication in terms of, you know, the color of their skin, or the question around sexual orientation, or the religious values they hold, or questions of ability and disability. And then, of course, the question of health and status and all that. I mean, there's a whole complicated area around reproductive health right issues, right, where you begin to see how acute, you know, the gendered apartheid is. And we, you know, we seriously need to sort of kind of tease out a lot more around that, and linking it to the right to development, the right to dignity and all of that. And you know, particularly around sort of the advent of, you know, COVID-19 and the existential threat of climate change and all of that, we know that this is going to accentuate those existing, you know, power differentials in society, right? But I also wanted to say that as we look at these differences between men and women and the kind of gendered apartheid, we also have to look at the ways in which some of these gendered categories also carry, right, the weight of patriarchy, the weight of racism, the weight of sexism, they can be homophobic as well. They can be racist as well. They can be ethno-nationalist too. I have way too many examples if anybody wants to refute what I'm saying. But the point is that for each of these categories, we cannot look at them romantically. We have LGBTI persons who are racist, right? I know of a particular incident. I was teaching in Germany at that time, and there was a queer theorist who had come in, and she was going to be given an award by the LGBTI community there because they wanted to sort of celebrate the work she's done in terms of pushing the boundaries around sort of queer theory and all of that. And she refused to accept it because she said that they were very quiet when the asylum seekers were attacked in that particular country. The LGBTI community was absolutely quiet and therefore complicit. So you see, I mean, there are all of these other dynamics and power differentials that we need to tease out, we need to think through when we think about discrimination. Discrimination is not a singular thing between two binaries. Discrimination can get very complicated. And that's why discriminatory laws are designed in the way they are. Because as you litigate, as you think about the remedies and all of that, you have to think through all of these things, right? And very, 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 as far as I'm concerned, there's a very clear line of demarcation between your right to freedom of expression and the advocacy of hatred. But for a lot of people, those boundaries are being blurred. And this is why we have to keep going back to prohibited grounds of discrimination. You see what I mean? And so as society, we need to think about these things. And I can understand. It gets complicated in Fiji because, I mean, you want to identify through your peculiar subject position. And you want to say, look, but I am, by ethnicity, whatever. So how do we think about race before racism? How do we evacuate race from the vicissitudes of racism so that you and I can have a meaningful discussion about something without necessarily destroying each other's identity? You see what I mean? And unfortunately in this country, a lot of times when there are political disagreements and all of that, the moment people are not able to sustain a particular argument intellectually or otherwise, they'll quickly say, well, and they go for your religion, or they'll go for your ethnicity, or they'll go for your sexual orientation, or they'll go for your gender, or so on and so forth. And the ways in which people attack these things, almost as if it's so peculiar to you and this country that these diversities don't exist anywhere else in the world. So Fiji really needs to grapple with the question of cosmopolitanism. It really needs to grapple with the question of, sexual diversity, in terms of multiculturalism, in terms of linguistic diversity, and so on and so forth.
I'd just like to highlight this, that these days we see something called cancel culture, which is rapidly growing, especially on social media, which is a way for people to call out those who are either participating in racist or other discriminatory practices and calling for some sort of either retribution or some sort of direct impact being made, saying that you need to call it out, you need to say that this is happening. And we saw it more than ever last year, especially in America, what with the divisions between within the country with the lead up to the elections.
Yes.
And we see that becoming a trend even here in Fiji. And this deserves quite a lot of attention. So stay with us. We'll be back with more on that particular subject after this break. Welcome back. Mr. Raj, this is our final segment, and continuing from where we left off previously about so-called cancel culture, which is a movement of sorts where people of all ages, backgrounds, ethnicities, and also nationalities are calling out things that which they see are blatant forms of discrimination, whether it happens to be happening at a workplace or in the home, or even what's happening on a national scale politically. And we saw some change being brought about, especially with what was happening in the wake of COVID-19, with all of the xenophobic behavior and attitude displayed against those of Asian background. And that, of course, got people talking. Here in Fiji, we don't necessarily have it on such a large scale, but we do happen to have people that are calling things out on social media, which goes back to what we were saying in the first few segments about voicing opinions in an appropriate manner.
Again, I want to be an antidote to all of that. I mean, it's good. It just reminds me of how society can function and have these entrenched, values of discrimination, right? And yet you could go to, say, McDonald's or whatever, and you can buy a cup of Coke, which will have all the stripes of rainbow in it to subtly say, let's be more inclusive. And so, and yet there's an aperture between these two realities. So discrimination is going to flourish in society, and the commercial sort of ventures are going to try and homeopathically inject this other kind of consciousness, right? Until the two meet, we are living very different realities. And this is why I think that that debate between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, I think encapsulates this kind of anxiety that I'm talking about. It's very problematic. It's very problematic because on the one hand, the struggles that African Americans have are very peculiar, and you can't just whitewash it by saying all lives matter. On the other hand, the point is that when you begin to think about discrimination, it's just not black lives. It's black lives that are lesbians, gays, might be upper class, lower class, a black person with disability, so on and so forth. The chain of equivalences begins to open. And then there are whites who don't enjoy whiteness as a privilege, that might be on the margins of that society precisely because, one, they don't subscribe to the ideology of supremacy, or two, they might espouse to certain religious values that might not be part of the mainstream. Three, they might be from a particular stratum of society that is not necessarily. So the reason why I'm saying this is that the cancel culture and all of that is good in the sense that you got to call things out. But beyond calling out, I mean, you have people who become the poster child, right, of anti-racism or whatever it might be, and it's so glamorous. Some of these campaigns are so glamorous, and you choose, the elite of a particular society who are going to pick up these fights. But then something else is happening on the ground, where people don't have access to social mobility and all of that. A person in a rural, remote, community might be facing the same kind of discrimination, while in the urban landscape, there's a huge poster of this film star who is saying, no to racism. You see, we got to bridge that gap. These are two realities that radically oscillate, in that same space. And this is why there's got to be some conversation between the two. Otherwise, what you're going to have is this, and the cancel culture is part of, this whole sort of kind of other cultural movement. And, it keeps picking up the trends. I mean, the hashtags keep changing in this world all the time, right? And, somebody else is going to, become the poster child for some other kind of struggle. But the point is that some of these inequalities persist over time. So we need to be very, very careful that these struggles don't get commodified because somebody is trying to, gain mileage and so on and so forth. We really need to change structures on the ground. We really need to fight stereotypes. We really need to, wrestle the bull by its horn, as it were, and take on the issues. Multiculturalism is not the code word for politeness. We must learn to debate, over differences, but in a respectful manner, without attacking somebody's race, religion, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. You see, for years, we've enjoyed Chinese food. Then comes COVID-19. And then all of a sudden, you know, somebody takes to the social media. You and I did this interview, you know, a few months back, where somebody is saying, oh, you know, these Chinese people eat all sorts of funny food. I mean, really? You've been enjoying, you know, chop suey over the years, uncritically, and then all of a sudden you're worried about what they cook and what they eat and all of that? Are you kidding me? You see, that's how insidious the whole thing is. And suddenly, the, you know, the tide just, you know, changes, and the wind begins to blow in the opposite direction, and all of a sudden, the Chinese who were loved and adored, and they're so different, and we all want our dosage of yamcha, suddenly become this whole biopolitical threat. You see what I mean? And in that kind of context, where there are trends in terms of cancel culture and all of this, and pick up one fight and go for it, to the persistence of certain kinds of discrimination in society, we need to bridge the gap between the two. If we don't, and if we let go of these incidences where, you know, a child is being singled out for, you know, wearing a beard and all of that, that's where we're going to go. Right?
So would you say that it's correct that the cohesiveness between what we want and how we are going about getting what we want is just not on the same level?
We are talking past each other. There are lots of people in this country who still don't get it in terms of why we are making so much noise about this stuff. Like I said, social amnesia, willful forgetfulness. They forget the Fiji that we've all intimately inhabited, right? There was so much racism in this country. There is still racism in this country. There is communalism in this country that we don't want to talk about, right? We talk about religious differences in terms of, you know, whether you are Sanatan or whether you're Arya Samaji, in Muslim, whether you are, you know, from this sect or the other. Christians, whether you're Methodists or Catholics and all that. And some people spend their lives carrying on those differences. It's their obsession because that's how they identify themselves. But can we take those differences and use them as our strength, as the basis for conversation across differences? That's the real issue. And in that context, you have the likes of, you know, Ben Padarat and others who will try and sow seeds of division. And if nothing else works, let's pit children against each other. What do you get? Next generation of people who will have nothing but contempt for anybody who doesn't look like them, who doesn't eat what they eat, who do not smell the way they smell, so on and so forth. This needs to stop. This has to stop now. We need to teach our children to learn and know and feel differently than how we grew up. We grew up in a culture of hate, year in, year out. That's all we knew, right? We need to look past that. Indo-Fijians need to stop thinking of Ethokes as non-humans. You see, loosely they use the word Rachat. Right? That was the word that I was thinking of earlier in my interview, and because I've got diabetes, so I have a hard time remembering. But they loosely use the word Rachat, right? And that's not cool. Ethokes should not harbor stereotypes about Indo-Fijians and all of that. We should not have stereotypes about, you know, Muslims and non-Muslims and all of that. People have lots of, you know, pejorative things to say about somebody's genitalia, about circumcision and all of that. You see, it starts with a single joke. It starts when you banalize somebody, when you say something pejorative and all of that. And before you know it, it's actually built into hatred. And then people, you know, sit back and they question and say, why there's so much hate? Well, there's so much hate because you stayed quiet when you were supposed to speak out against this. This is why we're here today.
Thank you very much for joining us for this particular segment and also for this show, Mr. Raj. And we hope that there's going to be more tolerance moving forward. Thank you very much for joining us for this show tonight. We'll see you again next week.